Is Aram Moshayedi, and I'm a curator here at the Hammer. It's a pleasure to have New York-based choreographer, artist, curator, writer Will Rawls with us tonight. And Will be presenting his current research as part of a residency with the Hammer that began in January of this year. Since the Hammer's residency program was initiated in 2005, nearly 40 artists have been invited by the museum's curators to engage in open-ended research to develop new projects and new works, to experience Los Angeles and its artistic and cultural communities, or to simply benefit from the luxury of time. A hallmark of the Hammer's residency program is the freedom given to residents. Resident artists are not obligated to produce or exhibit anything, though of course many, if not most, do. And thankfully tonight, Will has decided to do something with this time in LA. And for his part, he has been using this opportunity to research and experiment with various art practices that engage language and performance, specifically around the question of how speech and writing share communicative properties with dance. This inquiry, as part of Rawls's larger practice, considers the ways in which dance and language establish divergent and complementary cognitive processes in both viewer and performer. Last month, Rawls invited the Hammer's audiences to experience a work in progress as part of an open studio session here in the Nimoy studio. The presentation offered something of an experimental format, troubling the very parameters of what completes a choreographic work and what the pressures of public presentation afford and what they belie. Organized around Rawls's recent foray into stop-motion animation as a choreographic language, the work in progress questions what constitutes communication and even what constitutes an utterance when a performer's body and identity is subjected to the mediating lens of the stage. This is particularly relevant given that performance seems so predisposed to forms of photographic representation and mediation that by their nature curtail, if not inhibit, one's communicative and potentials. As revealed by Rawls's recent research, the herky-jerky stutter of stop motion is one such place where these ideals can congeal and take shape. So I'll leave it to Will to talk about this in relationship to his broader practice. But before I do, a bit of biographical context for those who are not already familiar. Will Rawls's choreographic work has appeared in New York at the Museum of Modern Art, Danspace Project, Issue Project Room, the Chocolate Factory, New Museum, Whitney Museum, MoMA PS1, the Abrams Art Center, and the Emily Harvey Foundation. Other presentations of his work have taken place at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C., and the Portland Institute for Contemporary Art in Portland, Oregon. And it's really my great pleasure to have this kind of first opportunity to work with Will in the context of Los Angeles, as he's kind of here, both hiding out in the apartment, but also on stage for you all to devour tonight. So thank you.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you to the Hammer Museum for letting me do or not do things for the last 3 months. Yeah, particularly to Aram Moshayedi and Ike Onyewenyi for organizing all the details of my coming and going and learning the city. You said it probably better than I'll say it about the stop motion and how it relates to dance. That's a kind of project that's very, very new, and I'll get to that at the end. I'm going to start more with a kind of overview of my practice as well. Lately, I've been kind of joining the ranks of lecturers who talk about their commute to the lecture as the way to start the lecture. And so I've been starting with sort of the metaphor of flying. And I wonder if there's some edifying detail to extract from the experience of flying, from the experience of being lined up and ID'd, unshod, undressed, unpacked, scanned, photographed, x-rayed, rifled, Corralled, vetted, summoned, stalled, rushed, packed in tightly, and then choreographed for potential fire or water disaster, overcharged, and ultimately undernourished. And if so, how many of us feel that this is unnecessarily paranoid behavior masquerading under the allegations of safety? Or sometimes a flight anecdote is about how my body passes through security, yet never fully acquires it at any of its destinations. Or, because this is the United States, sometimes I think my flight anecdote should be about the dream of collective ascension. And more cynically, I've thought, since this is the United States, that the plane crash could be a more useful metaphor. An event of devastation, disruption, and disassembly, punctuated by the presence of body bags, and why we as citizens could consider the body bag as one of our most unifying symbols. One that remains symbolic to some and all too operational for others. And it was with body bags that poet Claudia Rankine and I first started our collaboration with a friendly disagreement. We were contemplating the abstraction and negation of black people in the United States. And one has to think abstractly about a person in order to witness and directly or indirectly participate in the negation of their existence. This is all sort of typical casual conversation with Claudia Rankine. And so we were searching for, and for those who don't know, she wrote the book Citizen and Don't Let Me Be Lonely, great books. And so we were searching for a material that could visually transform the performers from people into abstractions and back again. And so we thought about the body bag as a ubiquitous symbol of the kind of erasure we were contemplating, that we face. But as soon as the thought arrived, it became a huge point of contention. And I won't give away who was for or against. But can a body bag be abstract? Or more precisely, can a body bag be abstract yet? And the question of where we are in history versus where we are in the now, and what the now allows us to do, or what we can't do yet, is primary for both her and me. I'll return to my collaboration with Claudia Rankine, but I wanted to take some more time to taxi down the runway. But okay, taking, somebody cast me in a sitcom, please. Taking the long way is something that I borrow from Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges, who in his pulpy detective tales is constantly chasing characters named Jorge Luis Borges around narrative labyrinths, only to catch up with himself at the end. At that point, he looks archly and semi-apologetically over his shoulder at us, the readers, who have dutifully collected what the two Borgeses have left behind. Bits of historical fact, mystical clues, obscure citations, abstract sensations, and poetic gestures and images that may or may not add up to a good reason for this chase in the first place. So this is fair warning. Borges demands backtracking, restarting, and repeated suspensions of disbelief to arrive at the end of his texts, which may be the end of the story, but is oftentimes the end of our comprehension of what unfolded. He emphasizes the acts of writing and reading as endless acts of coding, decoding, and unraveling the contours of what a story could possibly be. His stories practice being stories, and do so, in a sense, with mixed results. But they almost always manage to be totally gorgeous acts of writing, of fictionalizing himself and anything his pen encounters. Other than sharing Borges's habit for publicly gobbling his own tale, there is something that I love about the repeated readings required by Borges's stories. This experience of being left with the work of making meaning has tremendous value for me as an artist. And it's something that I identify in the potential of dance and choreography to also open up new, unbelievable, and indeterminate worlds. Worlds where people will want to embrace the work of piecing together the clues and events and accept this kind of activated, partial understanding as intentional, important, and as maybe the only possible outcome of beholding another human being. In this sense, I am a dance skeptic. Rather than apprehending bodies, my performance works are committed to raising more questions about bodies. I'm not invested so much in capturing bodies as in giving them the temporary freedom to roam unsecured. The first work that I'll share is work that came from this very kind of roaming. In the summer of 2008, Barack Obama was running for president, and I made my first trip to the Balkans, or it's also known as the ex-Yugoslavia. It felt like a hopeful, if naive, moment in US politics after what had been 8, for me, miserable, embarrassing, and warmongering years of the George W. Bush presidency. So as I zigzagged aimlessly, a privilege of an American passport, from Belgrade to Istanbul, I was greeted by strangers who sometimes nicknamed me Obama. His figure had appeared in the Balkans well before I did, through the media lighting the way. This encounter of the image and my body in motion has stayed central to my work ever since. And representing the first black presidential candidate felt like a drag performance that I couldn't shake. On the other hand, representing black Americanness to new strangers felt oddly in sync with aspects of ex-Yugoslavian history that I had begun to research and continue to do so for 5 years. It seemed that the Balkans had operated as a kind of dark side of Western Europe for so many years, and it had experienced its own profound ethnic and some might say racialized ruptures in the 90s, where the image of your neighbor, the media image of your neighbor, supersedes your ability to relate to him or her. It is that rupture of becoming the different one, that simplifying and reductive magic trick of representation, that fed this work, The Planet Eaters, which I will attempt to bring into, oh, wait, no, I wanted to, okay, pin on that. The Planet Eaters. Out of curiosity, I started asking, what are the parallels between blackness and Balkanness? And how is the contemporary, with its capital C, always seeming to stand on the folkloric to swan dive into the future? As the culmination of my research in 2013, I went back to Serbia to study at a folk dance school in Kikinda, a small city in the northeast of Serbia. It was there that my teacher, Igor, and 25 teenagers gave me access to dance, music, and storytelling that have become tools for leaning into these ruptures and differences. When I was there, learning the dances, I asked, literally holding hands, 6'3", towering over all these sort of just post-pubescent kids, I asked a 17-year-old girl how long she had been studying folk dance. Not long, she said, just 10 years. I knew then that I would remain an amateur in the context of this project and that it should never be taken as an authentic representation. But what else might it be? How could embodying the work be different from quoting it, citing it, or taking a picture? It is a myth. It became a myth about trying to assemble things that cannot be assembled, but perhaps can be embodied, instead of simply represented. It is also simply about keeping the question of what else might this become, what else might I become, going throughout this and subsequent works. Choreography is usually a set of procedures, tasks, and rules, and edits that maneuver dancers into some kind of significance. But no single body can ever be contained by the laws that shape it. And having spent years as a dancer, working for several choreographers, including myself, there is no notation for choreography that remains fully applicable from one project to the next. The act of dancing can be, in itself, wildly indeterminate. One of the things that dance does the best, in my mind, is produce ambiguity. And I've been watching dance since I was 7. And this strange inconclusiveness of dance, in turn, inspires choreography to drop into place, like a proper syntax lands on stream of consciousness. It is why we have dance vocabularies from which we can build longer phrases that help us follow a logic, whether that is mechanical or narrative, thematic, virtuosic, musical, and so on. But choreography, truth be told, is also indeterminate as a science. And paraphrasing choreographer Jonathan Burrows, I'm always asking, how much choreography do I need? Or what kind of dancing for which place and when? Choreographer Martin Spanberg writes of one approach to dances in which the dancing is treated like an alphabet that is constructed into sentences that can be translated, or dance that becomes visual symbols that can be securely attached to a narrow set of meanings. But, he writes, if dance is made this way, there must exist, so to speak, a master key, a tool or diagram with which all dance can be deciphered and understood. Such a tool has often carried the name reason. The term master here sends a shiver up my spine as it conjures up the foundational American practice of the ownership of black bodies and the power to speak in place of the people to whom those bodies actually belong. But it also implies choreography that manipulates bodies only as dancing signs that replace particular people or characters in service of larger narratives. And I agree that we're in service of something larger, but I'm always curious about this particular moment. Mastering a dance technique is something that dancers can spend their whole careers pursuing, when in the end there is so much left of the body that is unreasonable and messy, injured, and unable to fulfill the symbolic demands of this approach to dance. That said, the dancer is still always up to something. They are communicating, working it out, sounding it out, sometimes all at once, sometimes in an order. The unreasonable truth of our bodies has been there the whole time, somewhere between technique and behavior. I was thinking along these lines when I created Personal Effects, a solo commission for Performa 15. I chose to present it in the flood-damaged basement of West Beth Artist Housing, where Hurricane Sandy had obliterated decades of artworks that had been stored there by the resident artists, including some costumes and sets belonging to the Martha Graham Dance Company, which they had just brought there after taking over the storage space from the Merce Cunningham Dance Company, which had just moved out. And then there was a hurricane and a flood, and all these things were destroyed. And reconstructed by an artist, Eve Loris Cohen, which is another story. But the sonic qualities of the space and the difficult sight lines presented by the many columns pushed me to use my voice to signal my presence as much as my body. As I worked through the idea of bodily storage and physical archive, my voice became a soundtrack for my movement, allowing some play between images, narrative, song, and abstraction. I thought of it as a dance history out of order, a history that materializes in relationship to the symbolics of the hoodie, and all that the hoodie has expanded to mean since Trayvon Martin's death. In the underground of all this dance history, it was a foray into creating uncanny and sometimes violent transitions between human likeness and cartoonish animation. In Western contemporary dance, to live and work in a contemporary dancer's body is to be nearly interchangeable from one context to another, to hand over one's skills, sensations, and energy to another's abstractions from project to project. It is to be the image of everything that a dance wishes it can be. Yet, of course, this interchangeability is complicated when dance is developed to gloss over the particularities of how bodies are racially marked, in favor of the splendor of keeping moving at all costs. Constant movement is something that André Lepecki discusses as the preeminent emblem of dance, defined by the moment when systems of writing down movement appear in Renaissance royal courts. When choreography begins to get written down on paper, dance is understood as the body disciplined to move according to the commands of writing. It's really organized. There's spatial arrangements, pecking orders, motifs, heteronormative romance, and lots of rehearsal. The process began demanding that dancers approach dance technique as an end in and of itself, rather than a means towards something else, something more lifey. Everybody keep moving, everybody keep accelerating, everybody keep galloping across the abstraction the world is becoming during this expansion, this colonial expansion. And when the descendants of the colonized appear in dances in Western theaters, or in TV commercials, or sports arenas, or the evening news, the roles still remain so basic, or sometimes sensational in the most predictable of ways. Sponberg goes on to say in his essay about dance that perhaps each dance can necessitate its own practicing, which I take to mean that we can move away from the demands of the certainty of technique and find alternate ways to practice a dance, no matter how strange or seemingly meaningless. Why not insist on our own presence as a dancer while asking people to witness? Scholar Saidiya Hartman has also written about practicing performance in relation to the profound rupture of the Atlantic slave trade and the countless colonial subjugations that helped to establish the wealth of the West. She speaks about certain performances conducted by Black people as happening in a space of dislocation and rupture. She's writing about the particular complexity of understanding one's body, one's dancing body, in one's own time, while trying to address one's relationship to history and form and ancestry. But so much of this process is shrouded in her words, is shrouded in loss, dishonor, and discontinuity. She reflects, Rather than attempting to locate the origin of these dances or to classify Africanisms, I want to explore the way in which these practices witness and record the violent discontinuities of history. The traces of memory function as a phantom limb, in that what is felt is no longer there. It is a sentient recollection where disconnectedness acts as a mode of testimony and memory. I love that Hartman is also talking about indeterminacy here, much the way Merce Cunningham did, but differently. It's an indeterminacy that points to the very impossibility of establishing certain kinds of meaning at all due to the sheer incomprehensibility of chattel slavery and its subsequent institutions. It's also a kind of practicing without the proper technique, unsecured, unsecuritized by master narratives or conditions of choreography. And it may take lots of time rather than movement, may generate doubt rather than certainty, and it may disrupt our attempts to understand and narrate the dancer. For Hartman, the very practice of Black performance is already happening in a space of discontinuity, and in a sense, experimentation within a historical void, which brings up for me an enormous range of possible performance practices that could all qualify as dance. This question moves into choreographies of perception, embodiment, and exchange that may not always pronounce themselves through an I statement, but hold communion with the existential challenge of claiming a specific I in the first place. Claudia Rankin and I were set up on a blind date, so to speak. We decided, rather than restage her books, Rankin and I embraced the expressive edges of her poetry and the expressive edges of physical gesture, where we felt like their connection was seen through the human voice. After an early draft of the work, Rankin cut 85% of the text from the script we were working with, forcing us, much to my delight, into a void of narrative continuity, where the performers were required to fill the space with the effort to physically and verbally communicate with each other and collect in real time, inventing language in the now, and dipping into zones of consciousness that got dug up every time they performed. In deep dialogue with the performers, we were wondering if the labor of understanding a Black American experience and whatever monolith that has come to symbolize could be challenged by a proposal to witness a broad spectrum of possibility, fractured conversations, and play. It is a space where no single image can stay for long, and what is left is the collective labor of reimagining what the conversation is about, what is being communicated.
no, 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 blah, blah.
The abstractions of dance always have me wondering, what can my body say and what can it do here? What images am I producing and how do these contend with the sensations in my body? Which can I control? Maybe neither. In this sense, my dancing has always been tied up with language, the desire to change syntax, to write and rewrite a performance during the performance. This approach to choreography as a kind of discontinuous writing that is both historically situated and happening now seems to me better suited to unravel than secure the narratives around the bodies in question. And at the moment of unraveling, what might appear in a performance's language that we haven't seen yet or anticipated? I took this idea of discontinuous writing quite literally when I made Uncle Rebus last year as a commission for the Highline Park. I was envisioning language as manual labor and choreography as deconstructed storytelling. One of my first stage performances was as Brer Rabbit in 6th grade, the trickster character in the Brer Rabbit tales who was constantly outwitting his nemesis, Brer Fox and Brer Wolf. The tales are a contentious series of oral stories recorded and published by an Irish immigrant, Joe Chandler Harris, in the 1800s, who had an apprenticeship at a plantation in Georgia, where he overheard enslaved, he had an apprenticeship at a plantation, where he overheard enslaved people sharing these tales. Uncle Remus is a character invented by Harris to serve as the fictional narrator of these tales. Portrayed by actor James Baskett in the Disney movie Song of the South, Uncle Remus was the image of a jovial, colloquial narrator. I've never been satisfied with the way that these tales have been written down or with Uncle Remus as a figure, and how the apparent spelling mistakes that he makes are recorded and seem to mean to point out that the stories are childish or inferior or simply out of place in standard English. So in my mind, Uncle Remus needed a makeover, like a little zhuzhing, and I wanted the tales to require new work of the readers. So I pulled together excerpts from the Brer Rabbit tales and printed alphabets on plexiglass and developed an installation in the Highline Park that functioned kind of like a free-form abacus with letters instead of beads. In the excerpt, you'll see the dancers spell out excerpts from Brer Rabbit tales using punctuation and typos as tools to kind of push the question of spelling and the question of a word that has a meaning versus a question that is an image to new edges. However, one of the rules was that the order in which the words appear, the sentences that the dancers are spelling, and the order in which the words appear in those sentences is not always set. So it requires that the dancers kind of navigate with each other and figure out each other's kind of physical and cognitive space as a collective in real time. was cool about this performance is that passersby you could sit and watch the whole thing, which lasted 2 hours, or you could, as you're walking through the park, stop and look at it, and a lot of the people walking through the park would stop and try and sound out the words as they came along, which I thought was a nice kind of call and response. And so on and so forth. I transcribed a bunch of the sort of development of different words into a series of poems. So I just wanted to reproduce some of them here so you could see some of the spelling process. And I'm currently trying to figure out how to record these poems, like to read these poems aloud and record them for a project that I'm doing on the side. So if anyone has suggestions of how to pronounce an asterisk. I like this way. Can I use the pointer here? I like this. I like this sequence a lot. I like Mama Balin, Mama Balin. Anyway, itching for a minute. Okay. Uncle Rebus was a deep opportunity to think about citation again, what language we use to represent ourselves, and what it means when it is taken up by another. Performance is a space of just that kind of transaction, a space where images and kinetics and language meet, a space where a public gets to work with engagement and with the takeaway. And in the space of time-based work, some of the entrenched questions of history might loosen as well, presenting the opportunity for new reading. These questions are at the heart of what I'm currently working on at the Hammer and going forward. Where do images, like actual photographs now, and the movements of dance and the time of performance and an approach to language can meet? Last year I was given the opportunity to make an intervention into artist Anna Cravecroft's exhibition at the New Museum. She had turned a gallery into a stop-motion animation studio, complete with sets, lights, and camera in a fixed position that was taking a photograph every second. Where Anna was photographing abstract shapes, animating them through incremental displacements like claymation, etc., I chose to bring dancers into the room and explore these same questions, and I brought the letters with me. I think that was like something like 850 photographs, which is blowing my mind right now with stop motion. So yeah, currently I'm trying to figure out what stop motion does, how it gets in the way of dancing, and along the way producing images and staging bodies, and figuring out just that entire process. So I've just decided to kind of end with a little bit more of talking, and then just another showing of a couple films. In April and May, I was in residence in Arkansas, and I didn't have the dancers that I'm currently working with me, and so I put out a call to figure models that pose for drawing classes, because I figured these are people that spend a lot of time still, and could possibly be the right models for a stop motion experiment. And so I ended up making these, and I was housed in this sort of theater company that had decades and decades of costumes in archive, like 3,000 square feet of costumes, like Renaissance robes and like leather jackets and furs and tie-dye skirts and like bones and wigs and masks and armor and, you know, slave robes from different Christmas plays and all kinds of stuff. So I pulled a bunch of pieces and kind of began to look at sort of different genres of filmmaking, and what different kind of objects and costumes can tell inside of that. So this is an excerpt of a film I'm working on called The Collector. That's where that ends for now. So that's like an example of like more sort of very straightforward stop motion animation where you're working with objects and gesture and I'm really trying to find something else that that is more related to live performance practice and how to really bring the live performance into it. And so I mean, it's like a profoundly labor intensive for the performers, and the labor intensiveness is created by the presence of the camera and sort of trying to figure out how to work realistically, right, to create a sense of biomechanics, or how to kind of throw that out the window. And I think it's, you know, it's a great way of challenging this sort of other idea of constantly being in motion that I brought up earlier, and what kind of stillness and slowness mean, and how it lets you behold the person. And then the question comes up sort of, do we want to be captured on camera in a fixed position, and what are the other options? Like, so I'm thinking about blurriness and avatars and possible letters as replacements for performers. And these are all the ideas that I'm exploring next. And the other thing is that stop motion film is silent. And up to this point in my work, performance has allowed for the idea of animation, of animating myself or other performers, or performers animating themselves, and of animating ideas about history. Have been connected to how the voice and language are dance tools as much as the rest of the body. So this current project is looking at embedding a stage in a film shoot and staging the film shoot as a performance. And there's also this question of how photography and film relate to the documentation of dance that I'm still working through. Watching a video recording of a dance is as different from the dance as like looking at a painting is different from, looking at a painting of a flower is different from standing in a garden. And so nonetheless, like, there are these things that remain once the dance is done. And so I'm trying to figure out, could this current project I worked on here be a way to create an afterlife for these dances that don't claim to be the dance, but can stand alone as works of their own. So just to finish, this past June, I brought 5 performers to this very room to work on some of these ideas. We worked on different approaches to language and speech and writing and sound and narrative. I pulled a bunch of images from Joshua Tree in LA just as a kind of like thematic backdrop, which you'll see. And what results was a series of films that we also recorded the sound with this fantastic team here, and I'm still kind of actually learning what to say about it, but yeah, it's a rough cut, like all these kinds of lectures. So I'll just share the short film with you, as well as some of the stills pulled from the shoot.
The wind picks up, carrying sand into my mouth, onto my body. I'm here. Sweat sticks to my shirt, adding stains, adding smell. I'm here.
Hot planet boiling and seeping out of its pores and eye ducts. Sand trickles down a dried up throat, cracking from the inside out.
In the dried bed of a river plagued by drought.
Trickling down a dry riverbed.
And I can't. Is iridescent. My ribs are iridescent. My ribs are iridescent. My ribs are bizarre, 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 c'est bizarre, 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 bizarre. You're sorry.
Thank you. That's it. So we have about 25 minutes left. I know this kind of moment of asking a question is always questionable. So we could play a game. I have a game. If anyone has anything burning they want to ask, they can ask it. But maybe they can find a way to ask it in the game. So the game, you can breathe. You can also leave. I mean, also part of playing the game is also thanks for coming. You can leave. It won't be an interruption. That's what happens at this part. But the game, I will set a timer so it doesn't go on forever. And the original title of the game was Générique, which a couple of people I know who I can see have played before. But I like to call it Q&A. And the rules of the game are that we're going to assume that you've seen a performance that actually hasn't happened. And I made it. And you can ask any question you want about that performance, and I will do my best to answer it. Just like a Q&A. So there are people from the Hammer Museum that have microphones. And yeah. The game has begun.
I'll go for it. What was it like viewing yourself after the performance in the video documentation?
Let me do that. Well, I don't usually make performances that involve so many mirrors, and I felt like because the performance was about looking, I actually didn't watch the documentation because I felt like it would take away from, I mean, it's called Hall of Mirrors, the piece, and I figured that I took a bunch of selfies, which I'm figuring out what to do with. I'm just sending them to my family right now, sort of my first circle of critique, especially my younger sister. And once she gets back to me, then I'll sort of figure out if I actually need to watch the documentation. But I haven't yet. But thank you for your question.
So the temperatures in the room were very extreme. I was wondering what you're trying to express with those extreme physical temperatures in the space.
I mean, I'm into the abstraction of temperature in general, you know, and I'm not like a climate artist, but I would say that like part of what when it got, you know, it was really hot and the room was packed in, people were standing, if you remember, and so people start to sweat and there's all this condensation that goes into the air, and then when we drop the temperature really quickly, like all the mirrors fogged up, and so then we get this moment of like obfuscation, you know, which I felt like was important as a visual result of the embodied things that the audience were bringing with their presence. Other questions?
Yeah, there was so much like distanced, like reflection and surface. Like there was like surface area of the movement in these fragments and the mirrors and the
Surface area of what?
I felt like I was experiencing surface area
Yeah.
of the movement, and I feel like it has to do with this partiality and this capture fail. I'm just wondering, how do you think about like skill and flow and phrasing? Because when you dance, it's like silk, and your dancers have chops. And I'm just curious, how are you feeling through that tension between that loss, or what doesn't stick when we have only the surface thing? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think one choreographer, I think it was Jonathan Burrows, said, it's not about what you feel, it's about what the audience sees, which describes that huge gap between the performer and the audience. So I kind of resigned myself to surface at a certain point. Another choreographer, Deborah Hay, says the depth is on the surface. So I'm kind of caught between those two questions. But, okay. The surface of the mirrors and how like my flow of dancing related to the surface of the mirrors being surfaces.
Interruption of the fluency of movement.
Yes. Well,
Yeah.
I felt.
I mean, it could be a
yes.
mirror, it could be stop motion, it could be
Yes,
letters, it could
thank
be
you.
any interference that gives a relief of a thing that has a total that we're not getting.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think that like, you know, we live in the world of the snapshot, right? We live in the world of the fragment. We live in the world of the captured moment and like the immediately posted moment, which is supposed to stand in for the whole. And so I decided to try and like import that into the realm of performance, where I felt like the constant flow of movement is something that can be quite oppressive at times. Even though it's quite enjoyable, right? But like we can't always enjoy our performances, right? I'm kidding. But like, I think that, you know, I'm interested in labor. I'm interested in like the labor of dance and the politics of that, and also how the labor of that dancing shows up more when you're really trying to kind of hold an image up to the audience, which is back to the surface, right? Like, what does it feel like to be stuck in an image? And so I think the mirrors were kind of about that too. They came in later. Actually, originally there were no mirrors. And it was an outdoor performance. And then there was like too much interference, and my agent was like, you want people to be able to photograph it, so I brought it indoors, and so there was, people were able to see themselves like with me, or was it me, or refracted me. And so I also wanted to kind of, move slow so people could get a good shot. Thanks for your question.
Can you talk a little bit more about the feedback loop with your sister and how that might have affected this dance and how it's going to be affecting future dances?
Definitely. I think that like on all my grant applications, I'm trying to talk about how my dance is socially applicable. And I think that dance has like a social function, but I'm not always sure how to extrapolate that into like an ask for dollars. My sister is a social worker, and she does. She's kind of a first responder for women who are entering rehab for the first time, and often with dual diagnosis with abuse or homelessness or sex work. And so I feel like she has a really concrete grasp on whether or not what I'm doing speaks to, we sort of do this kind of like intense comparison game of like where this dance can take, the world and where her work can take the world. She's also a millennial, and so I feel like I need to check in with her a little bit about like what, if it's working, what I'm doing, and if it's translating. I'm like not quite a millennial, and I'm not Gen X. I'm somewhere in between. She's definitely identifies as a millennial. But I think also I work a lot with women dancers, and I think a lot about her her thinking about women and women's bodies in society, and how the reality of bodies who are disenfranchised or who need to seek help in therapy, and how that kind of, which is everyone, maybe if we're being honest, but how those kinds of questions for her can help me be a little bit more conscious about working with women dancers. I work in a field where 9 out of 10 dancers are women, and 9 out of 10 dance company directors are men, and even though the dance company model is dying, there's still oftentimes male choreographers sort of at the head of festivals and programs. So I think she's kind of instrumental in a lot of ways. She's also, moving out of her apartment, and I'm paying for her storage space right now, so she owes me feedback.
Thank you for that wonderful performance. So I'm interested in your concept of body as a physical archive and how it was reflected in this piece.
I think that like there's dancing that I've always done, and then there's dancing that I trained to learn to do. And I feel like it's most often the dancing that I trained to learn to do that I have to break up with in order to make a dance. And so there are the sort of the broken bits or the broken up bits of those trained dances, and then the bits of dances that I kind of learned by osmosis and socially, which I also learned in training contexts. I've studied ballet and jazz and musical theater and tap and Ghanaian dance and Guinean dance and non-dance and so I don't think that like dance can sort of like spill itself out in a kind of logical timeline, right? I think that all these dances also were practiced and have been practiced, let's say like have, at least let's say in the last 100 years, contemporaneously with each other. And so I think trying to, the idea of the archive is not one in which the beginning is so clear for me, at least in terms of what I want to put forward first as the vehicle for me to move in performance. And so I think I'm constantly sort of spinning the dial in a way. I mean, I think the idea comes first now too, which I also think is a kind of dancing. There's a lot of dancing I do up here before I move, or I'm moving and thinking, and then they kind of come together and then confuse each other and then have to come apart and come back together. So yeah, I don't know. And I think that like what spills out of our body is oftentimes more authentic than what we can say about our bodies or narrate. And so I'm always kind of digging for that, trying to create work. I mean, the like I did a piece, you may have seen it at some point, called Personal Effects, where I'm wearing a hoodie and kind of like playing with a bunch of strings. And I think that I was using my voice in a way that churned up a lot of memories and feeling, and not so much like a clear set of steps. And so I was kind of excited about how that that churning caused different kinds of movements to come out that I would then sort of like practice and revisit. But the performance really shifted in great ways and in nuanced ways from performance to performance. Thanks for your question. Yes. Yes,
Hi,
in the back.
yes. I actually wanted to ask you about the most violent moment in the piece. And this is the piece right after the mirrors have fogged up.
Yeah.
Right? And in this moment, you begin to violently throw your body onto the mirrors.
Yeah.
And that's the moment where sort of the other dancers are starting to come in and they begin to bind you. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Securing you from...
You can almost feel it.
From,
yeah.
from yes. Securing you somehow from what appears to be self-harm. Yet I was curious about your this investigation of unsecuring, yeah? And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that in the context of self-care.
Yeah. Let me call my sister. She's got like her last 5 posts are about self-care, so I'm gonna. I like stretched my quad to answer this question. Yeah, I think that watching a performance comes with a certain kind of ethics. And even though you might be in a seat, or I mean, when you're standing and someone's like, thrashing or throwing themselves against a thing, as I was, you don't have the sort of weird pod of your chair to protect you. And I like work that brings up that ethical question of being witness to violence or being witness to just the demands of dancing, which kind of grind your body into dust over time, let's be honest. Even the best dancers. I mean, the second you walk into a dance class, you're like aware of your mortality. You're like, oh, I can't. Maybe that's not true if you never walk into a dance class, but you always dance. Right? Maybe it's more of a pathway to life. Yeah, so I thought that like when you do something violent in performance, is it actually violence? Is it reproducing violence? Is it a representation of violence? And so that thin lines existed for me for many years. And what kinds of violence, the sort of a question is like, what can the now allow us to do? What kinds of violence, like, can a body bag be abstract? Like, what kinds of violence actually can be represented in performance? And of course, like there are purists who are like everything's fair game, and I don't know if I'm such a purist on any idea, right, or any concept of life and living, but yeah, I felt like that moment was really allowing the audience to sort of encounter their own ethics and bind me as a form of protection, but then that just exacerbates like my body being caught up and held down. Yeah. In the process of self-care, I don't know, I don't do any self-care, so, but I'm learning. California, it's like, whoa. It's like, you can't like take a step without tripping over a self-care regime. Okay. Next question.
Hi, I'd seen a lecture you'd given at the Hammer, and you talked about voice and language being dance tools.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering what that meant to maybe subordinate them, because typically they're seen as above dance, but subordinating them and making them as dance tools.
The timer's going off. But I'll answer this last question. I mean, yeah, who sees language and above dance? You know, I think that's a question. I think it's hard to do a performance where you talk and have people focus on the movement and and end up kind of just like using the language as a way to absorb what is being said and told and shown. Yeah, I like, spent a lot of time writing papers in college, trained as an art historian, so I was always like looking at images of bodies like painted on vases and, and in sculpture, and bodies melting and bodies dying and bodies leap, but never like a lot of discourse around dance itself. And so, and I felt like also being a dancer the whole time that I was going through that education that I needed to figure out a way to like make room for dance to speak and to speak about language, and to not also like leave language out, but to sort of see what kind of language dancing produces. You may have heard that I spent time in Serbia, kind of like studying folklore. Right, that lecture at the Hammer, you were there. And there, like, storytelling and dancing are all sort of one and the same, and that exists like across many dance cultures I've been a part of. But the commands of the voice in folkloric work are very much linked to the sort of the maintenance of the dance, and then like as the dance progresses, there's like a Macedonian dance called teshkoto, which means like hard dance or difficult dance, and it's like a durational performance. There's like a link on YouTube, and you should see it. It's crazy. And over time, the performers have to use their voices to maintain like the physical demands of the dance. And so sometimes I pull in pre-written text, and sometimes I see what kind of voice and language comes out from the dancing. Yeah, I mean, not as a binary, but just as a kind of like a soup again. Yeah. Thank you for coming.